Everyone. So welcome to week 8 and 9. So this is a combined couple of weeks where there will be a couple of different topics and you can do things at your own pace within all of the information. Be looking at the psychology of stress first, which is going to be this screencast, and then there will be and this may be more than one, and then there will be others that are more about emotions and stress. So it kind of all ties together. So for the psychology of stress, we'll be looking at different theories within psychology and how they define or talk about, explain stress and tension and so forth. So in the screencast, I am only focusing on four, and they are kind of four of the older ideas. Um, I think your text does a good job of talking about the others and all of them, but in these I thought I might be able to add a little bit more. So we'll be going over Freud, Jung, Frankl, more about Viktor Frankl. We talked about him a couple of weeks ago, a little bit, and Maslow. All right, so let's get started. So my other classes that I teach in life are psychology classes. I teach development, and we do a lot with theories. So this is kind of, this is my bag here. This is my other world where I do a lot of information. I'm trying to see why I can't get. Okay, there we go. So just asking, beginning with the question, what is the relationship between stress and our emotional well-being? We've talked a lot about how stress impacts our body and our immune system and our health. And well being, as we know, if we look at the wellness model and the wellness paradigm and the holistic model, is about all of us. And we know how just being stressed out plays a big role on our emotions and our mood and so forth. I seem to be having trouble with my clicking here. There we go. So we're going to start with Sigmund Freud. Um, Freud is an interesting character, and I'm going to have another screencast in there that I have done for my development classes that talks a lot more about the man himself and his life. In those classes, I'll ask questions like, when you hear the word, you hear the name Sigmund Freud, what are the first things that come to mind? And it's usually things like sex and pervert, and, that we just have come to really associate him with his, I'm sorry, there's a bee, with his, what is called his psychosexual theory. And yes, that was a big part of what he's offered psychology. But there is more to what he's done, and in many ways, he was way ahead of his time and had a lot to offer us. He was the father of psychoanalytic theory, which was one of the grand theories that of over the course of psychology's history. He was kind of the father of the unconscious, the idea of the unconscious. So if we believe there is an unconscious, we have him to thank for bringing it forward. The idea of therapy in general and kind of free talk and talk therapy, free association, first to look really at dreams in any significant way. Um, so he gave us quite a bit that we don't always think about. We're going to focus on some certain things, and I'm going to hide myself here so I'm not in the way. Hopefully, I don't know. Am I hiding? I'll move it over here just in case I'm not. Um, so Freud's personality structure, which is what we want to talk about today, the way he defined personality, had three parts to it: the id, the ego, and the superego. And maybe you've heard of those. Um, and so this is where he thinks tension is born within us a lot, is between these different structures within our personality. Now, when Freud first started out, he really wanted to study neuroscience and the brain, neurology, and be a researcher around that. And there wasn't any money in it at the time, and so he wanted to make some money. So he left that, went more into the psychology field, where he worked with people as a counselor, therapist, psychoanalyst. But he did have these parts of the personality structure that he did believe we would one day find that associated directly with parts of the brain. And what's interesting is we can, question that and wonder about that and say maybe, yeah, they do. So first we have the id. I kind of tend to call the id the devil on the shoulder, and that may not be really fair to it, because I also think of Winnie the Pooh as being all id, and infants being all id, and small children. The id in a word kind of wants what it wants when it wants it. It is unconscious, instinctual, and primitive. It is driven through biology and evolution toward immediate gratification. Um, and it works on the pleasure principle, what feels good. And I'm sorry that I think there's a lot of extraneous noise around me, and I do this outside, so I do apologize. I hope you can hear me. um, it definitely works on the pleasure principle. It just wants to feel good. Winnie the Pooh wants his honey all the time when he wants it. It's present from birth, and infants are kind of all in, and it serves them well for survival. They want to feed in order to live. And so the thing about the id is that Freud believed that when immediate need isn't met, then it can produce anxiety and tension, kind of upset the id. It doesn't go away, but most of us learn just over time to control it. So we might say, this is our oldest drives. And evolutionary theory might say these are the drives toward survival and reproduction, right? That we unconsciously are driven in many of our behaviors towards these things. So the id is that part of us that is driven towards things that bring us pleasure and help us survive and make us, feel good and happy. But as we grow older, hopefully, and as our brain develops, we do learn to control our impulses because it can be very impulsive. I really wish I had done the superego before I did the ego. Let me see for just a moment. I think I'm going to flip here and I'll flip back. So if you think of the id as the devil on your shoulder, you can think of the superego as the angel on your shoulder. It shoulds all over you. Um, it's the conscious moral code. It's our sense of right and wrong. It is the thing that will tell us you can't do that. You shouldn't do that. That's not the right thing to do. And it certainly plays a very important role. It is the thing that helps to regulate and control the id's impulses and desires. It develops as a child, internalizes the moral messages or rules and ethical ideas of parents and society. They learn them in school. They learn them they learn all different kinds of rules. They learn them in their sports that they do or their after school activities. They learn them at home. They get more and more an idea of, I don't know, tell our kids, you got to put your seatbelt on or the police will get us. And so kind of that moral law-abiding code that we learn to live by. And the superego contains that for us. It'll be different for people depending on what they're taught in their surroundings. Emerges around the age of 5 as children can kind of, well, you think about it, 5, they might start school, and you're going to definitely get even more than you get at home in terms of how you can behave around other people and what's going to work and what's not. Um, the superego's job is to suppress the drives of the id and urge the ego toward moral and good behavior. Drive shoulds rather than wants. We have the id with the wants, we have the superego with the shoulds. And then if we go back and look at who this ego is, so the ego has been bastardized in modern kind of pop psychology as this thing we're supposed to destroy and get rid of. And I think in the way it's used around that, we could have that argument. But the way Freud used it and coined it, the first to really discuss something called the ego, it wasn't like that. That's not what it was. It was actually the middleman. It was the thing that had to stand between all these wants and shoulds and figure out how to balance the personality and life in general, manage the tension between what I want and what I'm driven impulsively to get from myself and what I know might not, and what I have been told and know is appropriate. So it develops as a way to deal with reality in the face of the id's desires. Not all desires can be met immediately, or should not be met immediately. So the ego strives to find ways to express the id within the acceptable norms of the real world. So it does ask, how can I meet the desires of the id within the container of the superego? works on the reality principle. So that id, remember, works on the pleasure principle. The ego is working on the reality principle. So this is reality, and how can I get what I want within that framework? Seeing appropriate and realistic ways to satisfy. So delayed gratification. Develops as a child, learns the boundaries of reality, and continues development throughout life. We're constantly in this. Must balance the tension between the id and the superego. It's a hard job. Sees the self as being born out of the maturation of the ego, so the self. So if we think about that deep construct, and that's going to come up in a few of these. What is the self? That deep construct or essence of who we are. Freud and this personality structure would say that it's born out of the maturation of that ego and the result of ego formation. So then if we go back over here, this instinctual tension, the minds, and there should be an apostrophe in there, I'm sorry. The minds, which is that ego, superego, ongoing work of mediating the drives of the body or the id, because a lot of those instinctual impulsive desires are very physically, primally driven. And so it's the mind and the thinking, more later evolution self that has to manage these more deeply, longer seated parts of ourselves. So Freud believes it can be tamed but not eradicated. This instinctual tension, like this tension just exists. Freud believed we have innate stress, that just by virtue of being human, we are going to have this stress, the tension of what we want and what we think is appropriate and what we should do. And as we mature in being able to balance these and navigate this, this is how, we tame it and we mature and we form a self. So Freud had something discussed as an egg. It's also often discussed as the iceberg. Um, but he did have this egg that this. So the psyche is fragile. Believe that our psyche, our mind, that holds the self in a way, and so sees it as very fragile and protected by this shell, which is our ego. The ego's job is to protect that fragile self and that construct of self that we build. And so we put this shell, this ego around it. And the ego is our identity, how we understand and define ourselves, how we understand what we want and how we understand reality, and how we work to balance the two. The deeply internal id creates impulses that are constantly being released, striking the ego from the outside. From the inside, deeply unconscious. It has these primal urges and it's constantly trying to kind of get them out into the world and express them. And the ego must contain the impulses, much as the shell contains the yolk. This creates tension. Imagine if the yolk was in there, like beating itself up against the shell of the egg, then there would be tension that would be trying to like make it break, trying to break out of that ego shell. And the id is trying to do that. And so there's tension created as we try to contain those. External stimuli and pressures from society and culture hit the ego shell from the outside, threatening the wholeness of the egg, the stability of identity, and this creates tension as well. So you've got the id from the inside, you've got society and culture from the outside, which really has a lot to do with our superego, and all up against this fragile shell of the ego. Superego's perceptions of the id and the external stimuli will make it more fragile. The ego seeks stability and integrity against these forces. Its main goal is to maintain, hold together one's identity. Should be a comma there. Man, did I not read this? Under tension and threat, it will do what it can to protect the identity. So if we think about this, we build, kind of in broad terms, what Freud's saying is we build a sense of self, an identity, based on, all of this kind of trying to navigate these different forces within and around us. And then we do everything we can to protect that identity, to protect who we see ourselves as. And that's really important because it sees that identity of self as vital to our well-being. And so there's so much that's like beating up against it. and it's the ego's job to maintain that self. So we use defense mechanisms. This is another kind of term of Freud's and his concepts, um, to as like a security system, against all of that tension. Anxiety, stress response is the security. Another missed apostrophe. Is the security system's alarm when something endangers the integrity of the self. So, in the primary goal is to protect the ego, to protect, and what the ego is the identity and the self, the definition of who we are and how we see ourselves. So we will create defense mechanisms to protect that at all costs. Okay. So we'll talk for a second about, I wish I could see there, what these defense mechanisms are. I still don't know if I'm hiding or if I'm there, so I don't know. Sorry. Defense mechanisms are used in response to feelings of anger and fear, or stress, fight or flight. Each defense mechanism is a camouflage of reality, our ego seeing reality, if painful, attacking. I don't think I read this. If painful, attacking our most strongly held beliefs, values, perceptions, and attitudes. So the if the ego sees reality and it's painful and it attacks who we believe we are, attacks something primal and essential to that construct of self, then we will use the defense mechanisms to actually camouflage the reality rather than to face the truth of the reality. Now, Freud believed that the truth shall set you free, and that's what a lot of the therapy was about. Coming to terms, speaking, talking to the truth of what's going on for you. But he did believe that defense mechanisms are necessary as we develop and grow to some extent. So we use them unconsciously. We don't think about it. We use more than one at a time. Overprotection can be as dangerous as underprotection. So remember, the defense mechanisms are our protection. Protection helps in initial growth as we're trying to understand the world, that we have to have, I mean, the ego will just keep falling apart. Our identity, who we are, will just keep falling, and we will never have something, an identity that's um, has some essence to it if we don't protect it. But too much protection leads to stunted emotional and mental maturation. If we protect it too much, then we don't leave any room for continued growth, which is very important, right? So here are some of the popular defense mechanisms of Freud's. There are others, but these are some of the most popular. So denial. So, and maybe you'll see some of these from yourself or others that you've worked with. And in your work with people, you might see these coming up. Refusal to accept association with a threatening situation. So I don't have a drinking problem. I don't gamble too much. I don't do this too much or that too much. I don't have an addiction to anything. I don't shop too much. I'm not online. I don't play with my phone too much. So just basically denying the reality, arguing with reality, which is, doesn't ever get us far. Repression, unintentional. Now that's the big difference between repression and suppression, because suppression is one. Repression is unintentional forgetting of painful information. So it's really the brain working in a way to help us forget things that are too hard. It's the whole deep structure, hiding information from our conscious mind because it would damage the identity too much. Projection, taking what is found threatening or unacceptable and giving it to another, blaming others for faults of the self, expressing dislike of qualities in others that we don't see in ourselves. So I'm not defensive, you're defensive. Or I don't expect too much, you expect too much. It's basically whatever you say bounces off me and whatever that old childhood saying is, and lands on you. So giving to others what we either don't like in ourselves or that we feel we're being threatened by in ourselves. Rationalization, shaping truth to fit what we want to believe. being fired, saying how awful the job was anyway, or how awful the people were, and the relationship ends. And instead of being able to say, here was my role in it, not taking all the blame, but being able to see that everything is a dance that we are a part of, and at least recognizing our responsibility to something, it's rationalizing that it's all having to do with someone else, something outside of ourselves, blaming. Displacement, transferring unpleasant feelings by acting out against unrelated people or objects. So taking out anger at your boss on your children, partner, pet, something like that. So instead of you're displacing your emotions about one thing onto another thing. So if I'm mad at you for a argument we get into, but I don't know how to express that or deal with that, I don't. But then I go and I yell at or get mad at somebody else for it. Humor, using humor to deflect attention from the depths of feeling. We see people do this all the time. I think comedians, this is what makes really good comedians, is that ability to use humor. Um, Freud believed this is the most advanced of the defense mechanisms because it decreases pain and increases pleasure. Telling jokes when we're uncomfortable, that kind of thing. All right, so before we do Jung, I'm just going to go ahead and stop here and start Jung on the next video. All right, that's for Freud.